and thank you for the invitation here. This has been a wonderful 2 days I've so far spent at your university, a lot of intellectual stimulation, and I want to give as much information to my audience as I possibly can. What you're looking at right here, this beautiful scene, is a photograph that I took on August the 30th, 2008 at about 11:45 in the evening, and the sun is just setting. This is the Yenisei River, about 1,000 miles south of the Arctic Circle in central Siberia. This is one of the most beautiful and unspoiled areas of the earth today, very difficult to get to. This is an area that I was the first North American to visit in 2008. I don't believe anyone to certain of these areas from North America has ever gone before. And what brought me there was an interest in a particular native Siberian people called the Ket, which I'll be telling you a lot today. Their culture, their language is unique in North Asia, and it also appears to have parallels with a very important language family of native North America, which is called the Dna language family, consisting of the Athabascan languages that are spoken all the way from the Arctic Circle in Alaska down to Mexico, in fact. The Apache and Navajo peoples are thought to have emigrated from what is today central Canada about 1,000 years ago or so to their present location. Other Athabascan peoples migrated in prehistory to Oregon, Washington coast, and to northern California. So this family of Athabascan is also related to the Tlingit language of the Alaska Panhandle, and it's the most geographically widespread Native American language family. It's also the one that was thought to have come into the Americas last before the Eskimoan language family. And it is also the one of all these families that has a link with a Siberian language, which is called Ket, that is still in existence. But there are extinct relatives of Ket that were spoken over a huge area of central and southern Siberia that we know from place names and from other records. I'll be talking about both of these language families and comparing them, but I'll also be talking about the situation of being in central Siberia studying these languages. One of the things that makes the Kets special is that they were the last hunter-gatherers of inland northern Eurasia. Everyone else were pastoralists, within thousands of miles of them in any direction. And they maintained that lifestyle until during the Stalinist collectivization and sedentarization campaigns of the 1930s and 40s, they were forced to settle down in Russian-style villages, very sparsely located along the rivers in central Siberia. And that's where they live today, in these villages. And this is one of the first pictures of Ket people ever taken. It was by the first and only foreigner to visit the Kets in the 20th century, and that is Hans van Diesen, who worked for the Berlin Museum, and he lived there for 13 months, and then it became impossible to go to North Asia as a foreigner until after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But this area is so remote that even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it really was difficult to be able to get the logistics to penetrate this area. And this hypothesis that I'll be talking about of a language connection between the Yeniseian languages, the Ket language and its extinct relatives, and the languages of native North America belonging to the Dna or Athabascan and Tlingit language family, it is a hypothesis that's really been around for a few hundred years. Already in the 1600s and 1700s, the Russians and also Europeans who came through this region of Siberia, and the Kets used to live in a lot wider area than they do today, noticed that the Ket people didn't look or seem like any of their neighbors. They were hunters and not reindeer pastoralists, for the one thing. And physically, they reminded Europeans of Native Americans. And so already in the 1600s, we don't know when the first person did this, there's a nickname of Kets called Siberian Indians. And in 1708, a Dutch Orientalist who had gotten materials on the Ket people, some engravings of the Ket people, he made a hypothesis that the Kets are simply Native Americans who never went over into the Americas from Asia. And apparently that's turning out to be exactly correct. And in 1923 already, when some Ket language data, which had been published by Russians, came to the attention of other Europeans, And Italian linguist named Alfredo Trambetti noticed some similar words in Athabascan and Ket, just a few of them on the basis of just these few look-alike words, which could easily be coincidence. He made a hypothesis that the language families were related that I'm just showing you earlier, these particular two, and that's turning out to be likely correct as well. So this Dna-Yeniseian connection in superficial terms has been made already for hundreds of years. But now we have a lot more data on the languages, and also we have things like human DNA, we have more archaeology, and we're able to put together what probably happened in prehistory that would explain this connection. And that's really what this lecture tonight is about. This part of North Asia is special because it is the one area of North Asia that is not home to large cities. There's an area larger than France and Germany combined. Fewer than 30,000 people live in this area, maybe the size of your university, in an area that is enormous. Almost all of it is undeveloped and never has been developed. The oil and natural gas development is mostly in the western part of Siberia. Diamonds, uranium, manganese, and other underground minerals are mostly mined in eastern Siberia. The southern part of Siberia, where the Trans-Siberian Railroad is located, you have large cities and the majority of the population lives there, and you have industry there. But in this central area where the Yenisei River flows, there's never been any town in history larger than several hundred people. The largest one, probably located about here, has almost 1,000 people. And in this entire region, there's only one place where you can land an airplane. And all the other regions you can only get to by a long watercraft journey, and sometimes by helicopter. And that's where the Ket people live, and that's one of the reasons why they survived into the 21st century. Most of central Siberia, if you take a steamboat down the central Yenisei, looks like this. It just looks like it's never been populated. For miles, for hours, you can see no evidence of human habitation. If you fly a helicopter over the central Siberian forest, which is called taiga, you see for hours this kinds of landscapes with no evidence of humans at all. For hundreds of miles, this is the case. You see marsh, you see taiga, you see swampy areas, and this is what central Siberia still is like, even after 400 years of Russian penetration into this area. This is the river where the largest Ket settlement is located. You have to fly from the Yenisei River on a helicopter for almost an hour over completely uninhabited territory like you see here in order to get to this village. And what looks like manicured fields here, this is actually the floodplain of the river, and that's why trees don't grow there. This was not manufactured by human intervention in the natural world. So this is the Yelagui River, where the largest surviving population of Ket people live. And the only way to get there is on this helicopter that goes once a week to the village and stops for half an hour to unload supplies, unload mail, and take people to and from the different villages in this very remote part of the Russian Federation. This area is so remote, even today. In the 1930s, it was not even possible for the Soviets under Stalin to build concentration camps there. It was too hard to get people to those. It was too remote for the camps in this area. And the Kets in themselves, there's only several hundred of them. Depending on who you classify as a Ket, there might be 1,200. They're spread out in tiny villages near the river of the Yenisei or its tributaries in an area about the size of California. And out of that population, a large number of them live in this village. This village has 300 and some people, and a large number of them are Kets, and the largest concentration of native Ket speakers is in this village. And in 800 miles in any direction, you actually do not have any human habitation. And so you have a ship that comes twice a year and brings coal to a coal-burning generator that generates some electricity in the village. You have to provide your own firewood, and you better, because it's 40 below zero for 4 or 5 months at a time. This picture was taken from that helicopter that I showed you, and it actually is taking off. I was leaving the village when I took this picture, and the helicopter took off from this field, and you can see the dust that it kicked up. That's what that is. And when I lived in the village for a month and a half, in 2008, August 2008. I lived in this house. Actually, it was this house right here. That is where I was living in the village. Okay. The helicopter brings all sorts of things in, including alcohol, unfortunately, and there's a terrible alcohol problem in all of these small villages. And the alcohol is sold to hunters for the furs that they bring out of the forest, much like could have been 100, 200 years ago in other places of the world. And there is no medical help in this village. There really is no police force. If there's a murder or an accident, someone might specially come in once a week on the helicopter. And so if you get sick, it better be on helicopter day, especially if you get severely sick. This is one of the best native speakers, Tingliang, who I worked intensively with, both in the village, and she also came out of the village to some Siberian cities in the south. And I've worked with her a number of occasions. I was a guest in her house during this stay. There are fewer than 50 native speakers of Ket who are fluent in the language. I've been privileged to work with quite a number of them on 6 occasions, but only once in the actual village where they live. And I'm able to speak Ket and actually conduct interviews in the Ket language. And everybody speaks Russian. All the other Kets speak Russian. And Russian is replacing the Ket language. The reason why that occurred, you might be surprised. This is such an isolated area. The Ket people have survived for thousands of years. I'm going to argue they survived for more than 10,000 years as hunters in this general area of the world. How can it be that Russian is suddenly destroying their language and replacing it in the last 50 or 60 years? It's because of this boarding school that the Soviets forced the children to go to when they made them settle down in villages. Each village had a small boarding school. The children were forcibly taken away from the parents, who continued to nomadize in the forest and hunt. And the children were forced to learn Russian, taught in Russian, and they were made fun of if they spoke their native language. And so the boarding school was where the beginning of the end of the Ket language was. And the younger generations of Kets don't speak it anymore at all. And even if you have someone in their 60s who speaks Ket, like Tingliang, there is something special in their lives that has made it possible for them to maintain fluency or even have fluency in the language. Most of the fluent speakers are in their 70s and 80s. In her case, it's her elderly mother who's still alive, who in fact is only half Ket. She's half Selkup, but her native language is Ket, and she still speaks Russian with a very strong Ket interference. Her mother lived with her all of these years, and so they spoke all of the time. And so even though she went through the boarding school, because her mother always stayed in the village, she was able to maintain very good native fluency in Ket. She's also a natural linguist, even though she had no formal linguistic training. And when I would ask her a question, she would immediately know what I was asking about, and she would provide 10 additional examples. It was like gold to be working with her. This woman grew up fluent in Ket before the boarding school experience, and so she still has an accent when she speaks Russian. She also speaks Selkup. We recorded Ket songs from her, some of the only Ket songs ever recorded. This woman, much younger than most Ket speakers, also a fluent woman, expert hunter, lives with several dogs in the village. The reason why she is so fluent is because she ran away from the boarding school when she was 7 years old. She hid under a pile of hay near the village until they stopped looking for her, and then she rejoined some of her relatives in the forest, and she never came back out of the forest until the 1990s. And so she's a fluent, completely fluent Ket speaker, and I was able to work with her, learn a lot about the native spirituality of the Kets, and there were some irregular verbs in the language that had never been fully conjugated, because Ket verbs have special parts of them that denote both the subject and the object of the action. A verb like to kill has over 30 forms, distinct forms, and when you add the past tense and the present tense, it has even more than twice as many. And I was able to get all those forms from her, an entire conjugation, and that turns out to have crucial evidence to the connection with Athabascan, that particular unusual archaic verb. Of course, she was tired of saying 50,000 verbs meaning killing, and she didn't even want to work with me for the next day. But then she warmed up again to me after that. When I was in the village, I spent a huge amount of time trying to fill in the gaps of the knowledge of how the Ket people called all the plants and animals in the region of Siberia where they natively lived. Other researchers had recorded some of that, but I'd spent over a year learning from Siberian atlases all of the names of the plants, all of the names of the animals. I had pictures coded scientifically to the Latin terms for all of these different plants and animals and insects that we didn't have native Ket words for. And when I was in the village, because most of the people had not had a connection with the forest, there were very few people that could add any new information to that list. And when I left on the helicopter, I was feeling extremely frustrated. Fortunately, we made another stop on the Yenisei River where, at a huge town of about 500 people instead of 300. And in this town, even though 95% of the population was Russian, there was one Ket family, the hunter here that you see, and his wife, and he knew everything. He knew all of the hunting terms. And he himself had been raised in that village, but he ran away from the boarding school when he was 6 and hid under an uprooted tree for 2 days until they stopped looking for him, and he went into the forest and rejoined his aunt and uncle. He grew up in the forest. He's the last Ket hunter. He's the only person on earth that really knows all of this information. And of course, thanks to him, I was able to record all of it, or at least all of it that he knew. And so working with him was like winning lottery if you were a field linguist, because I had given up hope that there was such a person, and they turned up. Okay, my trip was sponsored by Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, who also sponsored my visits to that institute, and even brought a native Ket person to Germany for the first time, who I worked with intensively in the institute for over a month. We only just sat and spoke Ket, and I recorded all sorts of folk tales. I recorded a UFO sighting that the Kets claimed they had in Ket language, and so this was incredibly valuable research. And because there were other linguists who were very good typologists, like my colleague Andrei Malchikov, he came and would ask the Ket informant questions as well, and he had more sophisticated questions than just a narrow specialist such as myself, and he discovered amazing things about the Ket language that we hadn't been able to discover on our own. So together, we really made a lot of progress in documenting this language that's very quickly disappearing, and that's not connected to anything else in North Asia. In fact, it's connected to this language family, which in itself is an extremely ancient family, extremely diverse family that covers all of this territory. The 30 or so Athabascan languages are all related equally to one little language that survived until 2009, which the last native speaker died out in southern Alaska, called Eyak. And Eyak and Athabascan go back thousands more years and are related to the Tlingit language, which is a very big language. It still has a few hundred speakers in the Alaska Panhandle. And this is a language family that took about almost all of the 20th century in order to truly demonstrate that these languages are related to each other. And the verb structure was one of the key elements, because these languages have a very complex verb structure. The Yeniseian languages are also a family. It's not just Ket, and here's where the modern Kets live. There used to be Kets living farther to the south, as well as other languages, a whole range of languages that were recorded. Sometimes the grammar was recorded, sometimes only word lists were recorded, but we actually have a whole family of languages that we can reconstruct and probably go back 2,000, 2,500 years. We also have all over central Siberia place names of almost every small river in an area that's probably about the size of eastern United States. All of these words are Ket words. All of them are dialectal forms of the word for river, and it shows where all the different dialectal forms of the Yeniseian languages originally were located before the spread of pastoral peoples, before the spread of Turks and Samoyeds and others. The place names survived, and so this was once an enormous family geographically, just like the family in North America that's linked to it. It still is an enormous geographic family. And what is the linguistic evidence connecting these two families? So far, there's over 100 cognates. Cognate means there's a word in two separate or more languages that is thought to descend from a common proto-word in a mother language. For instance, English and German are known to descend from a common language a couple thousand years ago or more that we call Common Germanic. And in English, we have the word white, and in German, we have weiß. And in English, we have the word what, and in German, we have a cognate to that, was, and we have lots of words where the t in English is corresponding with a s in German. A w in English is corresponding to a v in German. And this is the same thing that we have in these two language families, even though there is only a small amount of these words that have been so far found. There's also the verb structure, and the pieces of the verb that have meanings are also shared between these two language families uniquely in the world and not with any other language families. And there's other ways to make nouns that are shared between these two language families also. And all of this is the beginnings of real proof, evidence that these two languages were ultimately descended from a common proto-language, which I suppose we could call Proto-Yeniseian. One of the things that makes Ket so unusual in North Asia, it's the only language that has tones. It's the only language where you can change the pitch or melody of the vowel in a word, and it completely changes the dictionary meaning of the word. And there are 4 of these in the southern Ket dialect that was spoken in the village that I showed you. We have what I call the high tone, sul, means blood. And if you cut off the pitch by squeezing your vocal cords together, you get a completely different word. Sul is a type of fish, a Siberian white salmon, which in Alaska is called inkanu, or she-fish, if you've been to Alaska. If you elongate the vowel and make the pitch rise and fall almost like a sing-song, sul, then you're meaning snow sled. And if you make the pitch fall very quickly, sul, it's a holding hook for, say, a cradle or for something else that you're suspending. These tones are completely unlike anything else in North Asia, and each of these tones has a correspondence to consonant features in the Athabascan language family. And here are some of the correspondences. In Dna, when you have a consonant at the end of the word where you close your vocal cords when you say the consonant, like sink. In Yeniseian, you have the high even tone. The lengthening of the vowel and the higher pitch is compensation for what used to be more energy put into the pronunciation of the consonant. So every time in Yeniseian you have this high even tone, in the Dna languages you have the glottal stop at the end of the same cognate, same syllable. If in Dna you didn't have the glottal closure, in Yeniseian you have the other tone, where you kind of get lazy before you finish saying the consonant at the end of the word, and so this would be koten. And so this is what is called a systematic sound correspondence. But all of these sounds also correspond. The other consonants and vowels, and when they look different, like the ah corresponds to the o here after a voiced g, and after a voiceless one it would have stayed ah. So everything in these words correspond to different rules simultaneously. And here's an example of how that works. In Dna, we have lots of words that end in a consonant like d or s or t. Those are called obstruents. And sometimes you can see there is evidence that there was a nasal sound before it. You have a nasalized vowel. Nasal means you have the sound coming out your nose and you pronounce it. But for the most part, you have the evidence of this obstruent. The nasal is very sparsely attested in the evidence. In Yeniseian, it's the other way around. You have the same cognates, but the nasal is always there, and it came through very clearly. That's the part that survived. And the obstruent that used to be after it is only in irregular combinations, irregular plurals. There's just little pieces of evidence that it used to be there too. But when we compare these languages, we find that there must have been a proto-language in which the nasal plus the obstruent was a regular feature of ways that words could end. And so this is another systematic sound correspondence. And it works with the glottalized and non-glottalized in the tones. And the different vowels, the consonants also are systematically parallel. So this is how those 100 or so cognates work when you compare the language family. When you look at verbs, Yeniseian verbs are unique in all of North Asia because it has the most meaningful part of the verb, at least in the core vocabulary, is at the very end of the verb. And all the grammatical information is put before the verb in what is called prefixes. In all the languages around, the Finnic languages and Turkic languages, Mongolic languages, the words are made exactly the opposite. The meaningful information is at the beginning of the word, and you put suffixes for the grammatical. So Ket is the exact opposite of everything else in North Asia. And guess what? In Athabascan Iaklinkit, in Dna, you have exactly the same kind of system. You have the same system of prefixes. And it's not only just having prefixes, but some of the prefixes are the same form, the same meaning, the same position. So this intricate verb structure that is unique to Ket is also shared in North America. And in North America, it's unique only to that language family, Na Dene. In Algonquin, in Siouan, in Cherokee, we have completely different verb structures, not like Na Dene. So it's these two language families that share not only the cognates in vocabulary, but also this extremely unusual, very complicated verb structure that seems to have survived for thousands and thousands of years in both language families. And that was something that raised the eyebrows of some linguists when this information was brought out, because it was generally thought that very complex structures of verbs are so complex that they must be transitory, that they must be like big long strands of protein that easily break down and don't last through time. But in fact, it turns out that this kind of a structure of a verb is persistent. It tends to stick around for thousands of years. There are roughly similar types of verbs in unrelated languages in Central Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, in the Caucasus Mountains, in other parts of native North America, even though the structure is completely different. The general complexity of the verbs are similar. And we did a seminar, myself and Joanna Nichols, last January, and it turns out that in all the languages that we surveyed that has this type of structure of words, it is ancient in every last one of those families. And so this is a very typical feature that tends to persist for thousands of years, this kind of a morphology structure that's almost like a chemical formula. It's called templatic morphology. So this turns out to be a regular rule and not some kind of strange exception when we look at Dna-Yeniseian comparison. What is important to focus on is that just like Ket is unrelated to everything in North Asia, the Na Dene family, even though it's spread out and you've got fingers of it going down into the American Southwest and into the Pacific Northwest, it's completely unrelated to all those other languages. There's dozens and dozens of other Native American languages, presumably brought in earlier before Na Dene, that are not related to Na Dene at all, that are radically different in all sorts of ways in their vocabulary and the way they make verbs and so forth. And that's important to know, okay? And so Ket is the same. This Yeniseic family has nothing to do with anything around it. Everything has the opposite. Yeniseic has tones. Everything else doesn't have tones. Yeniseic has prefixing verbs. Everything else has suffixing verbs. So it's really almost, it's an extremely stark contrast. But the Ket language does have some relations with the languages around it because of borrowing and contact. The Kets for thousands of years have inducted marriage partners, sometimes from other tribes with other languages, and over a period of time that has caused words to be borrowed and other features to be borrowed. And it is a very interesting thing that in the Ket vocabulary, just like in the English vocabulary, you sometimes have synonyms. Like in English, we have the word sick and ill. They both kind of mean the same thing. Why do we have two different words? It's because the word sick is the original word from ancient Old English, and ill is borrowed from the Old Norse, from the Vikings. And that is the same thing we wind up with in Ket when we have synonyms. This word kut, having to do with shamans and to perform shamanistic magic, seems to have parallels on the steppes with steppe nomads and Turkic peoples. The other one has no parallels anywhere else in North Asia, and guess what? It has cognate in Athabascan. It seems like it's the original one that comes from many thousands of years ago. So the root that means to cure by singing, to perform what we would today call shamanistic magic, it's a root that's in all the Yeniseian languages, and it's the same cognate root that's in all the branches of Na Dene family as well. So that's the origin. The Kets themselves, like I said, were hunter-gatherers. They had a very distinct lifestyle that took them to the riverside in the warm months, and in the cooler months they would go away from the river, and each family would hunt on its own hunting trail up into the wooded forest, and they would then congregate as it got warmer again and come back to the water. And each month was named after something significant in their traditional economic cycle. There was Eagle Month, Chipmunk Month, there was Pike Month, and there were a few other months that I'll tell you about in a moment for things that were not so pleasant in their life cycle. The only domesticated animal among the Kets was the dog. No reindeer, no horses, no cattle, just the dog. And this is a cute dog. And then some of the dogs, the Ket village, for every one person, there's at least 2 or 3 dogs. Everyone has hunting dogs. People still go out. October is called dog hunting month because you go out with your dogs hunting when there's not heavy snow at that time. This dog followed us in our boat for 3 miles along the edge of the river, just one in company. And so we moored it and let the dog in the boat. And I learned all kind of Ket words for get in the boat and so forth like that. So forth. So that was good. But not all the dogs are so nice. And that is one of the dangers of being in these Ket areas, because some dogs are trained to guard the houses, and they're vicious. And if you accidentally touch someone's fence, they'll actually attack you. The dog will attack you. And I was walking with the native speaker I was showing you in the other photographs in the village, one of the villages we took her to after the expedition was done. And she accidentally touched the fence when we were walking by, and a vicious dog came out and attacked her and knocked her down, and I had to actually fight the dog off. And so it's very dangerous. You have to know your dogs if you want to walk around a Ket village. You better be good. You better not forget either who's good and who's bad dog. All other Siberian peoples, for 1,000 miles around the Ket, they all have domesticated reindeer. The Kets never domesticated reindeer. There was a tiny attempt to do so in the 1930s and 40s, but the Kets just couldn't resist it, and they shot and ate all the reindeer. This is why the Kets survived and didn't become reindeer breeders. The part of the Yenisei Valley where they survived is unbelievably infested with mosquitoes. It is like clouds of mosquitoes and black midges and biting flies. So June has the biting flies come out. July has all the mosquitoes, and then the midges come out. And July is so bad. By the way, the word mosquito is cognate in both language families. The mosquitoes are so bad in July that the Kets actually call July Sudokip, which means mosquito flying month. And traditionally, the Kets had a type of houseboat that they would get into when the mosquitoes started hatching out, and they would sail down the smaller tributaries of the Yenisei into that enormously wide river, and they'd anchor their boats in the river for those 3 weeks and fish. There's delicious fish in the Yenisei, and the mosquitoes couldn't fly across those 2 or 3 miles of the river, and they were safe from the mosquitoes. And then when mosquitoes died down in August, I was told that August is after the mosquito season, but when I was waiting to get into the helicopter and holding all my belongings for about a minute, I was bitten by probably 100 mosquitoes, and that was after mosquito season. So it's almost impossible to be out on the street during this time, and the Kets had an ingenious way of dealing with that. None of the other pastoralists could go there because these herds of reindeer, you couldn't keep them in this area in July. They'd actually suffocate from breathing in mosquitoes. That's how dense the insects are in a particular period of time there. So all of North Asia is repopulated by reindeer. And really the reindeer revolution that started in South Siberia, probably in 2 independent hearths of reindeer domestication that was probably patterned on the horse and cattle domestication on the steppes. People in the forest who hunted reindeer said, why do we need to go out and hunt? Let's just capture reindeer and see if we can keep them as herds like those crazy people in the grass do with those horned animals. So that's probably where reindeer breeding got started, and it revolutionized all of North Asia. Almost all of the original traditional North Asian languages, probably some of them were also related to Native American languages, they all disappeared. In the last 3,000 years, they got replaced by languages from the south having nothing to do with Native North America and nothing to do with the Ket, for instance. Only the Kets survived, and that is all in all this area of North Asia. Now, there are people who are also hunters in the Pacific Rim, and these people are hunters of sea mammals in rocky areas where there's really not much place so you can have herds of reindeer. These peoples, the Eskimoan peoples in the north, they're in Russia. They have relatives still on both sides of Bering Strait. The other groups here, the Ainu and the Chukchi, they seem to have come up from the south during the middle part of the Holocene after the Ice Age. And they also have nothing to do with Native North America, and they also have nothing to do with the Kets. So even though both of these groups are sometimes called Paleo-Siberians because they're big traditional reindeer or cattle breeding tribes, they really have nothing in common with one another whatsoever. And so now we get back to this interesting idea that the Na-Dene languages and the Yeniseian languages, they're separated by a long distance of nothing related in between. How can they possibly be related? How can you bridge this geographic and time depth is there anything else besides language that would give us evidence that such a connection actually existed in prehistory? First of all, why isn't there anything in between? Why is it on the middle of Siberia you have to go to find these relatives in native North America? Well, I already answered that. Really, it's because in the last few thousand years, all of this area was repopulated by reindeer breeders. And if you look at the DNA of reindeer breeders, there's little bits that is similar to native North Americans and to the Kets. And the other is similar to peoples in the south because that's where the reindeer breeders came from. So it's obvious why there aren't relatives in between for that reason. The reindeer revolution is the reason. Okay? But that's not enough to understand where the connection was and how did it get to be the way it is today. So how can you assess prehistory when there's nothing written down? Language is only one of the ways. And I've got to stress that you can only prove languages are related by linguistic evidence. You can't use archaeological evidence, human DNA evidence to say languages are related. That, it might be coincidentally a parallel, but it's not proof of any. Language relatedness can only be proved by language. But there are other ways to test whether there is a link between populations in prehistory. Language is one of them. Archaeology is another. And a lot of what we know about the peopling of the Americas is from archaeology, what we've found so far. And a new powerful way of understanding human prehistory comes from studying the DNA of human beings. Most parts of the genetic code of human beings recombine from the mother and the father when the child is born. It gets all mixed up and you can't tell what came from where. That's called autosomal DNA. But the DNA that is in the Y-chromosome of males is only passed from father to son. And so you can see a direct descent for thousands, 10,000s, 70,000 years. Who is related to what male and how closely. It's amazing. Same with the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria is in the nucleus of the cell. All the mitochondrial DNA in both males and females is inherited only from the mother that is contained in the egg. And this is direct descent from the female line. And then the males don't pass it down. It's their wives pass it down. So this is passed down through only females, even though males and females have it, mitochondrial DNA. There's Y-chromosome DNA, mitochondrial DNA. They tell us something about who is just distantly related or more closely related across the continents. And then there's traditional material culture. What kinds of lifestyles, what kinds of instruments, what kinds of snowshoes. All of these things are potential evidence for connections in human prehistory, even though they could also be borrowed. It's harder to borrow DNA. Okay, indigenous and spiritual culture, folklore, intellectual culture is also very important. And the more modern anthropologists, ethnographers study traditional peoples of the world, the more they come to respect the traditional tales and legends of the peoples. There's a lot more truth and scientific accuracy in them than people used to give credit 100 years ago or so. And that is the case as well. So what happens is that we have many ways of studying human prehistory, many strands of ways of studying human prehistory, and all we need to do is put them together. It's interesting that when we study language connection, when we know facts about language, it doesn't often directly match up with archaeology. In fact, it usually doesn't directly match up. When we study the mitochondrial DNA patterns of the world, they don't directly match up with the Y-chromosome patterns, even though a population must have had some connection to the past, and they should match up. And culture doesn't always match up with language. In order to really understand human prehistory, you have to have evidence from different types of disciplines that you feel are factual evidence, and you have to find a way to reconcile the apparent contradictions in all of this evidence. You have to say why the Y chromosomes don't match up with the mitochondrial chromosomes. You have to say why the language doesn't seem to completely match with the DNA evidence, and the archaeology doesn't seem to match with the DNA evidence or the language evidence. And if you can find a way to get all the contradictions so that they're answered by a single hypothesis, you're very likely to have a strong hypothesis about what really happened in human prehistory. But if you try to find DNA evidence that matches exactly language evidence, you'll usually fail. If you try to find archaeology that matches language, you'll usually fail. It's always only at best a partial match. And so that's what I'm going to do in most of the rest of the lecture. I'm going to give strands of evidence from these different disciplines, including language, which we already observed, and see how all of these things can be true. What could have happened in human prehistory that would explain how all of these seemingly contradictory things could be true? Let's start with the Y chromosome, okay? Y chromosomes only pass from father to son. So if you have a population, you can do DNA testing of the strands of chromosomes in the Y chromosome and really tell who's related to you 70,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago. It's amazing. And the mutations that develop are at a fairly constant rate, so we can within 2,000 or 3,000 years estimate how old the differences are. And so by doing this, we can look at the population of the whole world, the males of the whole world, and see which males on which continents are closer to one another, which are farther away from one another. And every mutation that's been found, we can give it a name called a haplogroup, and we give it a letter, and sometimes a number and a subletter for subvarieties of that. And when we do that, we can tell which populations in the old world have a male DNA, Y chromosome DNA connection specifically close to Native Americans. And when we do that, we find that almost all Native American males are descended from probably a single male who lived after the late glacial maximum, sometime, who knows, 15,000 years ago. And there's very little of this same haplotype of DNA in the old world, except real close to Bering Strait, where people were in contact with one another. Only the Kets have this. 90-some% of the Kets have the same male ancestor as almost all Native American men. It belongs to what is called the Q haplotype. And people who have intermarried with the Kets very close to them have more than average, but then it goes down to 2 or 1% or hardly any percent in all the other populations of Northern Eurasia. And so this is a striking, special connection between the Kets, and you can see it on this map, and the peoples of North America. And perhaps because the Kets have this male ancestry that is definitely shared, especially in its intensity with native North America, it might explain why Russians thought Ket people looked like Native Americans and not like other people. If you do tests of Ket teeth, Ket blood groups, the kind of DNA that mixed together between mother and father in the child, Kets look more like other Siberians on average, and the Dna and Native Americans look more like Native Americans on average. You don't see that ancient ancestry. But if you look at just the Y chromosome DNA, it is a distinct descent from a common origin, which I will argue was in this part of Asia about 15,000 to 17,000 years ago. A little bit later in the lecture, I'm going to argue that. Okay? When we look at the DNA of just the northern Athabascans, I'm just saying that because the Navajo mixed with Hopi peoples and Anasazi people, and they got new strands of the DNA in them. There's another type of DNA that is in this population, and this is another haplotype that is common in Eastern Eurasia, okay? And that is very interesting because where did it come from? What it is that C3 haplogroup is probably gotten into the Dna ancestral population before they came into the Americas, and they came in later than the earlier Native American populations who never picked it up. It came up the Pacific Rim, and it became prevalent after the Ice Age in North Asia, and it was spread specifically by the Dna. And when you look at where it is in native North America, it actually is in the same place as the language family is. And only intermarrying across that language boundaries do you actually find that it goes into other populations. This haplotype was spread by Chinggis Khan because we think it was his haplotype. And he was very successful at spreading it, and so he kind of wrecked the picture by spreading it all over his empire and his descendants and so forth like that. And he was able to do so because he had the Mongol cavalry in order to do that. And some people estimate that he has 20 million living male descendants today. Who knows if that's exactly true or not. But the Dna are obviously special in native North America because they have this DNA that they must have picked up in their male line after the other Native Americans had already come into North America. All right, let's talk about mitochondrial DNA, and then we're going to come back to the Y DNA because there's a huge question that I didn't rays that is screaming at you from what I already told you about, the Y-DNA, and I'll pick that back up if you haven't thought of it on your own. Mitochondrial DNA, let's talk about that. This is going to be a little bit more complicated. First of all, it's passed to sons and daughters, so everybody has mitochondrial DNA haplotype, every single person. But it's only passed in the female line, and so you can tell who your ancient female progenitors were from studying the haplotypes of the mitochondrial DNA. And we can do the same thing in the whole world, and we can see that there is migrations, there's evidence of migrations of females. We don't know what the males are doing during this time when we're just looking at this the mitochondrial DNA, and we can see who got into the Americas and from what part of Eurasia historically were they originally connected. And it's a lot more complicated story, obviously, you can see, for North America than the Y-DNA. And when we look at North America, well, not North America only, when we look at the Americas, there is thought to be 6 founding haplotypes of mitochondrial DNA that must have been brought in by the earliest migration or migrations, actually the pre-Dna migrations into the Americas. And that's a lot more complicated than the Y-DNA. And it's even more complicated than that, because when we look at the subvarieties of these 6 haplotypes, it looks like there's at least 15 different female lines that have come into the Americas and only 1 male line. And later the Dna brought a second male line in from North Asia. So the mitochondrial DNA pictures are a lot more complicated, and there's some more to be said about it. And among the northern Dna, however, it's almost only one of those haplotypes that's represented. So the Dna brought in mostly the haplotype we call A, actually A2, and hardly any of the other haplotypes that was probably from intermarrying with other peoples in North America after they got there. So this is fairly striking. So what do you think I'm going to show you next? How about the mitochondrial DNA of the Kets? Obviously, that's what's coming next. And when we look at the mitochondrial DNA of the Kets, we do have that haplotype that we have in the Athabascans, but it's a minority haplotype. It's one that nobody else much has but the Kets have all these other groups that are large as well. And some of them come from the east, some of them come from the west. The Kets are really interesting in the mixing of eastern and western mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. Haplotype H, which is the most common one in Europe, appears to be a recent admixture to the Kets. The haplotype among the Kets is the one shared by other Western peoples fairly shallowly. And the Kets are known to have intermixed with Selkups. Remember, my main informant had a grandmother who was Selkup. Maybe that is her haplotype as well as a result of that. The haplotype C is shared widely in eastern Siberia, and it is the eastern reindeer breeders, the women intermixing and being brought into the Ket society that brought that in. The U and the F, however, are not found in any other modern Siberian group, and they're also not found in native North America. So where did they come from? Fortunately, a very interesting archaeology project has been conducted for the last 10 years in the southern part of Lake Baikal, close to where we think is the homeland of the Ket languages because of river names and because of the geographic location of attested Yeniseian languages. This Baikal archaeology project did disinterred graves from cemeteries of hunter-gatherers near rivers that were flowing in or out of Lake Baikal. And the culture that they studied is called the Kitoi culture. And look how long ago this is. It's in already the early Middle Holocene, many thousands of years ago. And when they did DNA analysis of these fisher folk along the rivers, they found the exact high percentage of the same U and F haplotypes that are in the modern Kets. So it's highly likely that those fisher folk, at least the females, are some of the physical descendants of the modern Ket females, which were joined by other physical descendants from the east and the west fairly recently after reindeer breeding. And of course, my hypothesis is that the original haplotype was the A that you have in a mitochondrial shared with the Athabascans. So my theory is that the Ket males are, this is not a theory, it is the Kets are very patriarchal society. All Kets are Kets because they're descended from a male Ket. They're part of a lineage of male Kets. And females might be inducted from other groups. Maybe other groups were used as outmarriage partners, maybe those ancient fisher folk in the past, but it was the descent from a cat male that made you a cat, and the ability to speak cat that made you a cat. And I'm asserting that that is connected with the language. That Q haplotype is connected actually with the cat language itself. And on the female mitochondrial side, I'm saying that this minority haplotype A was the original one that was tended to be paired up with the Q in the original population that spoke the ancestral Dna-Yeniseian language. And the other haplotypes we can find where they came into the population at different times in prehistory, according to the hypothesis I'm presenting. So that gets us to a point where we can ask two very important questions that better be answered if we want to think that there's any kind of DNA connection with the language connection that I talked about earlier. Here's the real million-dollar question. If the Ket people, males, share almost all the Y-chromosome DNA with all Native American males, why did they only have a language connection with one of the many language families in North America? How can you explain that? That is actually a real big incongruity, okay? Because when people do DNA analysis of Native Americans and Kets, it looks like Kets are related to Native Americans at that deep level where they're related to all Native Americans, not just to the one where they have a language connection to. So that question has to be answered. And there's a second question that has to be answered. Why in native North America, if there were 6 founding female lines that you can break down into 15 sublines, is only one of them represented in the northern Dna? It's as if they came in with only one of them, even though the earlier migrations had all 6 of them. How can you explain that? How can you explain that? And that's the one that they share with the Ket. Here's my explanation. Let's bring in archaeology. When we bring in the archaeology of native North Asia, as the Ice Age was beginning to end, we had the rise of a special culture that was built around the use of stone in a revolutionary way. It's called the microblade culture. Previously, stone had been used in big lumps that was fashioned into a single blade, a single spear point, a single arrow. You had to have a lot of stones. You had to be close to location where you could make tools from these stones. But somewhere at the glacial maximum of the Ice Age, maybe a little bit earlier, but certainly this took off after the warming started, somebody got the idea that they could take just one piece of stone and very carefully split off these tiny flakes that were as sharp as chic razor blades. And you could take these tiny flakes, you can make thousands of them just from one stone, and you can put them in the long bone of a bison rib or into a heft of wood, and you can make a razor sharp blade that can cut through mammoth flesh, and we know that they used them for that in North Asia. And if they got broken, you still had the stone where you could redo the blade. It was the first disposable razor, but they used them on mammoths. And this microblade culture gave this group such an edge that they were able to expand and become much more mobile, only having to carry around a little bit of tool-making material. And it was this particular group that appears to have been the one that created the population of the far north as the Ice Age began to wane, as the ice began to melt. And this group spread out, and eventually it came into native North America. And we have the exact same microblades in northern Alaska, exactly put in the same rib that we have in Central Asia, this microblade tradition. But I am going to argue that these people and their language are the ancestor of Dna-Yeniseian. And the Q male haplotype and the A Mitochondria Dna haplotype are probably heavily the heavy genetic ancestry in this particular population, but these are not the first people who came into native North America. There were other tribes and peoples and languages that were already in the Pacific Rim during the Ice Age. They had come from different places. Some of them had come from South Asia. Some of them had come even earlier across northern Eurasia. Some of them were more Siberian-oriented. And they had their own mitochondrial DNA from ancient origins in different parts of Eurasia. And presumably they had also all sorts of diverse languages that went along with those diverse origins. Presumably also they had their own Y DNA that had come along from those diverse origins. And the Q male hunters were so successful that in the closing days of the Ice Age, they apparently supplanted the males in all of these tribes and societies. They became the dominant Y DNA, just like the Mongol C3 became so prevalent because of an edge in technology that existed in the Middle Ages. And so we don't know what the original Y DNA groups that would have been patterned with these are, but the Q hunters wound up becoming part of these societies, and as the ice continued to melt, maybe it was their sheer mobility and their induction into these groups and learning the languages of these groups and taking the mitochondrial lines of these groups. Those are the peoples that first came into the Americas. And this microblade hunter dispersal hypothesis explains why all of the males in the North and the Americas have a single ancestry, and yet the females are so diverse. And so the microblade creating big game hunters, they merged with these diverse linguistic and mitochondrial DNA populations, and they went into the Americas. And they were the first migrants. It wasn't the microblade peoples. It wasn't the Dna-Yeniseians. The Na-Dna came in quite a bit later than that. Okay? And so if this hypothesis is true, we might expect to find a few little remnants of other Y DNA in some of the ancient burials that we would find along this area. And if that is found, I think it would be strong evidence that the scenario that I'm presenting actually took place. Okay? Interestingly, the mitochondrial DNA is so much more diverse in the Americas, and I believe that the languages are more diverse because they are connected with the mitochondrial DNA. Okay. The Na-Dna peoples came in later, and they brought in predominantly the A that was associated with the Q hunters in the first place, and that is why they are much less diverse in their female DNA than the other native North Americans who came in earlier. Now there's a famous book, some people would say infamous, Languages in the Americas, where early DNA studies of Native Americans did show that the Eskimoan peoples were very different than everybody else. They had distinct different migration, and their language family is different as well. And the Na-Dna peoples with their C, Y DNA haplotype is also distinctly different, and their languages are different too. Everything else is much more diverse. Joseph Greenberg, who is a linguist at Stanford, made the idea that they're all related to one single ancient language that came in one single migration at the beginning of the end of the Ice Age, and that they are the first Americans, that there's this Amoran language superfamily that subsumes dozens and dozens of distinct families. This was very controversial. Actually, today I would say no linguist really agrees that this is possible. But no one has ever been able to show evidence that it probably isn't correct. Linguists up to this point have simply said, well, we just don't know. The evidence that Greenberg says he has found is not really evidence of much of anything at all. We just don't know whether there was one single migration before the Na-Dna or more. But I think there's evidence, very strong circumstantial evidence, that there were more migrations. And there were more language families, and I'm going to present that to you right now. One of them is coming from an unlikely source. In Moscow, my colleague Yuri Burushaski has spent the last 20 years making a catalog of folklore motifs in all the cultures of the world. And he finds very large numbers of similarities between certain kinds of folklore motifs in some continents and in others that must be very ancient. He found that in large parts of the Amazonian basin, there's unmistakable folklore similarities with Southeast Asia. And it must be extremely ancient, and it points to a group that must have had its ancient origins in this part of Eurasia to have this folklore bringing into the Americas. He also finds that in the mainland Asia, East Asia, there's a lot of folklore motifs that are similar to certain parts of the Americas. And that this suggests that the ancestors who brought those in were distinct populations that had some kind of roots to the peoples that lived in this part of the Americas. And then finally, he finds very distinct Siberian motifs that are shared widely in North America and also by the Kets. And this is not just the Dna, but even some neighbors of the Dna. What this suggests is that some of those languages that became the Native American languages came originally with their mitochondrial DNA, I would add, from Southeast Asia, others from mainland East Asia, and others from inner North Asia. And finally, the Dna, I would argue, as one of them that came from inner North Asia. So folklore motifs suggest that there wasn't one original migration, but there must have been at least a few. Mitochondrial DNA would suggest exactly the same thing, even more strongly. And then a book, famous book about 20 years ago written by Joanna Nichols, looked at typological features, features like word order and ways that, words are made across the world's languages. And she also found that different parts of native North America seemed to pattern more closely with different parts of the Old World. The same thing that I'm talking about with folklore and mitochondrial DNA. She found that some Native American languages did seem to have more of a patterning with inner Asian languages, and others with East Asian languages, and finally others with Southeast Asian languages. There's this increasing body of evidence from mitochondrial DNA, from studies of language typology, from studies of the folklore motifs, that there must have been a number of migrations from that earliest phase of the peopling of the Americas. And the Dna was just the last one that came from inner Asia. And finally, one of the pieces of evidence that was adduced for the Amoran language family, I think is really significant and should not be ignored. It is this pattern of pronouns where the pronoun that means I or me in a lot of the language families of the Americas, south of Dna, has an N sound. And the pronoun that means you has a M sound. This N-M pronoun pattern is found widespread in native North America. But it's only found in 1/10 of the families that Greenberg put into his Amoran superfamily. And Greenberg said that this is evidence of the whole family. What if it's only evidence of a single family that 10% of the languages actually belong to? This is my supposition. And what if that is also connected with one of those mitochondrial DNA haplotypes? And what if that is only connected with one of those folklore areas? And what if that is only connected with one of those typological areas that Joanna Nichols showed? That is the way that I think the future should look at these language families south of Dna that have nothing to do with the Ket. All right? And one of the ways of doing this with language would be to study the complex verb morphologies that I studied with Dna and Yeniseian. People should try to compare and contrast those verb morphologies in other language families of the Americas to see if they could get those language families deeper into the past. But I suspect that if they do, they won't find there's only one language family, Amoran. They'll find there's about a dozen or so if this research is continuing. So let's get towards the conclusion. If there really was a Dna-Yeniseian language link, how old would it have been? If it had anything to do with the DNA evidence in the DNA scenario that I'm presenting, and frankly, I can't think that there's any other way these two populations could have been connected than the way that I have presented, it must be really old. It must be towards the end of the Ice Age. And this is earlier than we think that language data showing descent from a common origin can survive, and that's one of the reasons that this hypothesis is controversial. Seems like it can't be this old, but when we look at the evidence from other disciplines that I present, it seems like the only way that these peoples could be connected is if the language link is older than we think language links can be. So that's a conundrum that I won't be able to answer in this lecture, except to say probably that this verb morphology is much more conservative than we've given it credit for in the past. So the Dna ancestors probably broke off from the Yeniseian ancestors somewhere in southeastern part of what is today Siberia. They came into the Americas later than all of the Pacific Rim peoples who had already been married to their cousins who also had the Q haplotype. And they brought in this C3b, a male Y DNA that they stayed in North Asia long enough to inherit and to incorporate, and none of the other Native American groups stayed there long enough in order for that to become part of their gene pool. There's one more really interesting piece of evidence that links these two language families across thousands of miles. And that is an unusual conflation of meanings in directional adverbs having to do with travel in relation to rivers, which is very important in all of this northern boreal area around the entire globe. In both these language families, you have a word that means going down from the forest to the river. And you have an antonym, a completely different word that means going from the river up into the forest. The same word that means going towards the river also means going towards the fire. The same word that means going away from the river means going back from the fire. And this kind of unusual homonymy is found in Ket, and it's also found in the Athabascan and Tlingit languages. And also, if you look at the morphemes, there is increasing evidence that the actual morphemes that are used for this contrast in the two language families are turning out to be inherited, not just this unusual pattern. And if you also look at where other language families are located that have this type of conflation of fire and water, you find them to be along the Pacific Rim in languages completely unrelated to the other two we're talking about, that it is almost like this could have been an inherited substrate from earlier populations who lived in this area who had a related language to the ones that are so far apart today. And I suspect that that might be true. And if one reads a modern book just written earlier this year about these orientation systems, you can see that these are uncannily similar, and these look like they are borrowing of the same idea using words from the native languages of that area. So to conclude, to summarize, this Dna-Yeniseian connection that now I've expanded not only to include language, but also DNA, Y-DNA, and mitochondrial DNA, archaeological evidence, and to some degree folkloric evidence. This explains why the Kets share most of their Y-DNA with all Native Americans, some of their mitochondrial DNA with all Native Americans, but especially with the Athabascans in quantity, folklore with only some Native Americans, the ones that came from North Asia, Siberia, and language only with the Na-Dene, because that was the core of that original microblade culture, according to the scenario that I produced. And that same hypothesis that I described also explains, for the first time, I think, why the Y chromosomes of Native Americans are so homogeneous, where the mitochondria chromosomes are so much more diverse. And why the haplotype A is so much, even though it's present already in South America, it's so much more prevalent in northwestern North America because it was at the core of that microblade culture. Much of the A came in with that, and only some of it spread earlier to the Pacific Rim. And it also explains why Na-Dene is not related to any of the other families of the Americas, because the Na-Dene peoples and the microblade culture and the original Q and A population really had nothing to do with the peoples originally on the Pacific Rim or their female ancestors or their languages. And so with that, I will say thank you, but especially to Andrew Bird and Carrie Birchfield for all the work that they've done for my visit. And thank you very much. Some more questions, and I'll be more than happy to try to answer questions, because we've gone quite far afield, and there are a lot of other directions or things that we could elaborate on in addition to what I've actually said in this lecture. I'd be happy to add some things about any of these topics that I brought up here, if you have some questions, or I could just start telling stories. Yes, please, the one here and then yours. Yes, please. Yeah.
And my grandfather was a student in 1908, and that was where there was that, I guess a meteor came down and knocked over a lot of trees in Siberia. So
yeah.
I don't know if those are, but I guess my question is whether the Ket have recollection of that.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because let me see, they do. And there's a really interesting story I could tell. In fact, I was gonna, before you asked the question, just to fill up the time. Let me see if I can get a good map of it. Let's see. I can't find my own slides. Where is that map of the languages that I had? I had a really good, oh, okay, this one will do. This will do. Okay, two things. First, the UFO story that the Kets told me was something that had just happened about 10 years ago. That it was night, it was dark, they were outside, and all of a sudden, something got so bright that it lit it up like daylight for like about 8 seconds. It's not like a flash of lightning. Everyone got scared. Everyone started hiding. They didn't know what it was, and then it was over and gone. And so maybe it was a meteor that flashed up the sky for so long. They didn't hear an explosion, but it might have been a flying plate, like they said. That's what they called it, a flying plate, flying saucer. And that was the story. They really don't know. As far as concerns the incident that you alluded to, in 1908, on June the 30th, over central Siberia, over the area where the Evenki reindeer breeders live, about here, apparently a comet fragment entered the Earth's atmosphere, and it blew up before it actually hit the ground, so it almost made no crater, but one piece of it hit the ground and made a little crater that's now a lake. And it destroyed an enormous area of trees, so that for hundreds of kilometers, you had all the trees knocked down in different directions, depending on where the blast came from the sky. And right over the place where the blast happened, all the trees were still standing up, but all the branches were destroyed off of them. And there's photographs of this. But this area was so isolated that an expedition to investigate it wasn't mounted for 20 years. And it destroyed an area far larger than Lexington. And it killed a huge amount of reindeer, besides destroying all that forest, and it killed a person. That's how sparsely populated this area is. But the enormous boom that it created happened during the middle of a very sunny day, and some young Ket women were on the river 800 miles away from the blast, and they heard the loudest peal of thunder they had ever heard in their lives. And they thought it was the end of the world. They were terrified. And then in the evening, the sky became bizarre. All kinds of colors and funny smokes, and that's the way it was for a week or more afterwards, and that's the way it was even in England and Sweden and so forth like that because of this event. They had no clue of it, and they told that to my colleague Heinrich Werner in the early 1960s when they were old women. And so there were people who were interviewed by my colleague ketologists before I started this profession who actually were witnesses, at least auditory witnesses to this event, and I think that's pretty amazing. But it also attests to how sparsely populated Central Siberia was then and still is. That is probably one of the few places in the world where you still could have an event like that and almost nobody would get killed in this general area. It's pretty amazing. So I'm glad you asked about that. And speaking of UFOs, if you go into this area, there's a tradition that there's lots of them out in the Ugrian areas, and I don't know if it's the urban legend. How can it be urban? There's no cities. It may be Taiga legend. I don't know, but that's the UFO hotspot that's outside of Kets, and I can't explain it, so either. But you had a question. Yes?
Yeah, you sort of made reference to the fact that prehistoric people sometimes leave their calling card in the area where they've lived
No.
by naming rivers or other natural geographical locations. If you look at Western Europe, for example, it's clear that before Indo-European speakers came to Western Europe, there were speakers of another language family, and their language is actually preserved in many of the rivers.
Very common.
In Western Europe.
Yep.
If the Kets moved across this very large geographical expanse to cross the land bridge into America, you would hope that maybe they would have left
I know.
some
Yep.
names of rivers or something in that area of eastern Siberia. Is there any evidence?
Well, this is called substrate toponyms, and if you look at any map of the United States, a large number of the American states are named from Native American tribes, I think even Kentucky for that matter, and also many rivers. You go down a highway and you see all these Native American names. That's particularly true in Washington State. 4 names of previous languages to be preserved on the map, you have to have actual contact between the older language speakers and the incoming people who replace them. They have to actually hear the words and say them and preserve them. And in the case of Western Siberia, we have instances where the Turkic peoples interacted with the Kets. The Samoyeds interacted with the Kets, and they took the words from the Kets. They knew those words because they knew the Kets. In Eastern Siberia, we really have whole areas where no one's done toponymic research. And so far, we haven't found any direct evidence of Athabascanic names or Yeniseian names. But all it would take is one population change where there wasn't extensive communication between the incoming and the disappearing people for those to be lost forever. And it is possible that we will find some evidence in Eastern Siberia. There's places that just no one has looked yet. And also it's possible that the evidence no longer exists because the peoples didn't contact one another for the names to be transmitted. For instance, when all these Evenki people came up, just the last 1,000, 2,000 years this happened. Maybe there were people living there who had borrowed the names from the ancient Proto-Yeniseian peoples and they still had those words, but maybe they weren't transmitted to the reindeer breeders because they disappeared or didn't actually interact with them when the reindeer breeders took this over. We just don't know. But I think it's important to hunt, and if there is no names there, that is a significant problem that you'd at least have to hypothesize why not. My suspicion is that this is the hearth right here, and the Dna peoples came up here, and this is where we have those river systems and the substrate river directionals. That's where I suspect that you might find some of those names. And like I said, there's whole areas that no one's done any research on, and I'd like to do that. I think that's valuable no matter what you find. But that's a good question, and that's one that needs to have a better answer than the one that we know so far. Next, any more question? Another question about this area? Yes, please here, and then you. Yeah.
So you mentioned other Yeniseic languages a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about are there written records? Are there, audio recordings? That would be amazing, but probably not.
Well, good question. I will answer it. This one I have good answers for. Let me get our map back up. Where is our map? Okay, let me get the map of the Yeniseian languages back up somehow. The ones, I don't see it anywhere here. All right, okay, let's see. Here we go. Okay, so here's the known Yeniseian languages. The Ket people were documented in the 1700s here, and then they were pushed farther north by Russians, fur tax collectors. They ran away from them and went farther north. Almost all the place names where the Kets live today are actually not Yeniseian names. They're Hanti names, they're Samoyed names, they're Uralic names. Even the river name Yelogui, Igai is the word that means the river in one of the Uralic branches. Okay? So Ket language is preserved in 3 dialects that we have tape recordings of, extensive documentation of. The relatively closely related Yuk language died out only in the 1970s, and we have actual tape recordings of it. We know how exactly the tones sound in that language. It's very important. The Kot language was recorded by the famous Finnish linguist Matthias Kastren in the 1840s from the last 5 native speakers, and we have a whole grammar, we have verb conjugations, we don't have recordings, and we don't trustfully have a real documentation of the prosody of the tones. We can only sort of guess that if they were there. The other languages were recorded only in word lists by travelers in the 1700s, and there's more that wasn't recorded than there was recorded. But there's enough basic vocabulary and even a few verb forms recorded from these other languages to give us a fairly good picture of what Proto-Yeniseian must have been like. We have a lot of evidence from those word lists and those 3 languages that have complex grammars. So actually, myself and Heinrich Werner, who was the one who interviewed the people who heard the explosion of the comet, we've written an 800-page dictionary that incorporates every last bit of information that's ever been recorded about these and trying to figure out where each word came from. It's over 800 pages. It's a huge amount of information. So there's a lot recorded, and of course it would be nice if more. There are also a whole series of river names that obviously are the same word for river, but they don't belong to any known recorded Yeniseian language. There must have been at least one more branch that was existing in river names that just never was a single word recorded at all. And that's amazing. And that is the Tish-Tush. Even the word Irtish, the river Irtish probably was originally a Yeniseian word. The Tish is river, it's Tes. Okay, and so we just don't know what that was. So there must have been whole branches of Yeniseian, at least one that just wasn't recorded at all. Is more complex than what we know. And where were the Yeniseian peoples before this? We don't know that either. Were they farther to the east? We absolutely don't know. There's absolutely no evidence that they recently came to Siberia. In fact, all of their DNA are ancient Siberian, as I think I proved. And I would also argue that their language is ancient connection that couldn't have been from some other part of Eurasia either. You had a question.
Yeah, well, actually two now. Looking at the list of languages, Ket and Kot.
Yeah. Ket means human being, means man in these languages. Yuch is an unknown origin word that is not really Yeniseian. And legend among the Kets is that the Yuch used to not be Kets. They were some other people that spoke some other language, and they became Keticized. And they started speaking this version of the Ket language. It's fairly close. So the Yuchs actually are physically different than the Kets. They don't look like the pictures that I showed you. They look different. And so they probably were some other language group that became speaking this language. The Kot don't call themselves Kot. This is what the Turks called them. And so the word Kot may have been an attempt by Turks to pronounce Ket. We're not sure. We're not actually sure where this word comes from, but it was used by the neighbors. And just often the words used by the neighbors is what the outsiders call the people. Like the word Mohawk for the Iroquoian people was what the Algonquin enemies called them. It meant man-eater. And the Mohawk Iroquoian peoples call themselves Ganiengahaka, which means people of the Flint country. But they think Mohawk is cool. And so in English, they're fine with Mohawk. And very often you get a name that's totally not appropriate from outsiders, and another group of even more outsiders borrow it foolishly. And that's what happened with the word Kot.
So we can't reconstruct the...
No. These are not reconstructible in the language family to one thing. And in Kot, there is a cognate to the word Ket, het, because the K turned into H in Kot. Yeah. So the het or hit is the cognate, not Kot.
So my
Yeah.
second question
Yeah.
actually relates to the slide about the down the river and up the river.
Yeah. Right. Right. I can get back to that. Yeah, go ahead.
So in connecting the Yeniseian with the lineages at the Basque, it
Yeah.
seems like you've got a process of vowel deletion at the beginning of the words. You have pharesis, you have penthesis.
Yeah.
But you also have,
Metathesis.
is that something that's unique to that one
No.
word, or is that a systematic process?
That's a fairly systematic process. Kwa participated in metathesis. Not only that, but in both of these language families, you also had a prefix. It was always upriver from something or someone. And so there's a possessive prefix that went on both of these that also is cognate. And the combination of the possessive prefix and those letter consonant combinations made a metathesis in Ket language. So that's part of a broader rule. And it's just pretty amazing that the words are turning out when we start understanding more sound correspondences and more morphophonemic processes to in themselves be cognate. Not only this unusual conflation. And this also not only means going towards the fire, going towards the river, it also means to come out into open space. And this one means to go away from open space, which is an extremely important concept for the tribal peoples around rivers. And this was all the same thing in both of these language families. Yeah, and so this is actually tea we made out of bark. We made that tea on an excursion in the forest with that dog. The dog was standing right over there, the one the nice one. That was a cool afternoon. And then it started a thunderstorm, chased us back to the village. So we were really going to get home. And that night, temperature went 40 degrees. Boom. It decreased 40 degrees because it's the beginning of fall. Fall is just a polite word for winter. And that was August 15th. And from then on, it went below freezing every night. And still in the day, the mosquitoes were coming out. No one had told them it was winter. So it's an amazing place. There's real extremes in temperature. And the spring is very quick. Suddenly you have hot wind. All the ice starts melting. You have huge floods, huge chunks of ice. And then all the mosquitoes come out, and everything's very intense. Then all of a sudden, it's hot and humid. It can be 100 degrees. And it's hot and humid, and then it starts suddenly getting cold again. And then it's freezing cold, and it never goes back. You never have a day like yesterday, or was it 2 days ago? That was amazing. You just never have that. And Siberian trees can't grow here because these kind of days like we had yesterday fakes them out, and they suddenly go into blossom. And they die. Even 20 degrees above zero will kill them because they sprout. So these trees that can survive in 50, 60, 70 below zero in Siberia, they'll die here because a bad warm day freaks them out. That never happens in Siberia. So anyway, yeah, that was a fun day. And I used that photograph later when I did research to connect it with the research on this. Those are photographs from my expedition. Yes?
It's widely accepted that dogs were the first domesticated animals.
Yes. Yes, they did.
The question is, can you do DNA studies of dogs between Siberia and North America and find similar sort of correspondence?
You know, people have done DNA studies of dogs, but they haven't done DNA studies specifically of cat dogs. No one cared or paid attention, and I honestly don't know what you'd find. The cat dogs look a lot like the Samoyed dogs that are all around. They don't seem to me much different. And I really don't know what the dogs were like in native North America. I can say, however, that I think the Yeniseian word for dog and the Athabascan word for dog is a cognate. That's one of the cognates. But it has a problem. There's a sound that is problematic. But there's too much that looks like it might be cognate for me to just throw it out. So I'll say maybe cognate. Yeah. But I think DNA studies of dogs is a big deal, and they should do more of it. In the context of North Asia, they should do more of this kind of study. I think that is really another great. See, there's already at least 2 research projects that have been described in the room. And I may be the third with those flying saucers, if you really want to go far afield. So I'm looking forward to the next question, because maybe there'll be even more research projects. Yes, please.
You mentioned that you had a colleague that was looking into the folklore and the connection possibly there. How well is that developed, and how does it, if it does, inform the linguistic?
Well, I think it's really interesting when you find folklore connections in areas you don't expect to find them. It's just like if you find DNA connections in areas you don't expect to find them. You should look for other possible connections. You should look to see if there's a language connection. And in the case here, there was a language connection, and they looked for folklore connection. And they found it, but it wasn't exactly parallel. It was more broad than just Dna, because probably the ancestors of the Algonquins also came from Siberia, not from the Pacific Rim. And they were part of that folkloric complex. That's one answer to that. But I think that in native North America, Yuri Burushaski has found that the folklore of, say, Washington and your Oregon Plateau, an incredible number of parallels with the folklore of Argentina and the area of Argentina up to Bolivia. Too many to be a coincidence. No one has ever compared those languages, ever. And why not? Maybe there's nothing, but if there's a folklore connection, maybe there is. And so there's all kinds of things that you could try because of these new datas that are coming out. And I think you should do it, yeah.
Yeah, regarding the language connection, so you kind of made a case here, but it's fascinating that there's connections with the Yeniseian language and the Navajo language. And I mean, just geographically, and even being surrounded by non-related languages, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I don't know a lot about languages and how that might be evolution there, but I know a little bit about proteins. And one thing that's really interesting about proteins is they will converge on the same function from completely unrelated DNA. So you give a genetic sequence a couple thousand years, it will converge upon the same function. Does language do the same thing?
Analogously, I would say yes, because when you have languages
If
that
the
are spoken
answer is
next
yes,
to one another,
that's really interesting regarding how something very Yeniseian could crop up,
uh,
and what's the time frame that would take place
Yeah.
without
Well,
the geographic.
when you look at Yeniseian languages and you compare them to the languages around it, you find that there are features of Yeniseian languages that have come to resemble the languages around it. And those features always you can show by comparison of the languages in the family to be superficial innovations that have come to imitate or copy or mimic the languages around it. For instance, in all the basic verbs of these languages, and I'll talk about this in the lecture tomorrow, the root is at the very end, like I said in this lecture. And in all languages surrounding, it's at the very beginning. So when you're inducting marriage partners who have to learn this Yeniseian cat language, maybe already as young adults, what happens is there's this kind of accommodation to the structure. The structure of Yeniseian gradually starts getting pulled in the direction of these other languages. So in modern Ket, even though the most basic verbs still have that Athabascan-like structure, all the productive ways of making new verbs have a root that's at the very beginning of the verb that acts like everything after it is a suffix, even though it was originally a prefix. And the original verb root has started to lose its basic meaning and just become a suffix. And so this is an accommodation to the opposite word-building techniques of the languages around it. And that is an analogous to what you're seeing with the proteins. You have what is called typological accommodation because of aerial contact. And it's not just because languages are spoken next to each other that this happens. It has to be that you have same people speaking both of the languages, that it kind of crosses over and mixes, just like I speak Russian so well it messes up my English. And so that happens over a long period of time with a real language and a real language community. And so you can see in Ket all sorts of fantastically interesting features that have developed because of the influence of languages around it. But you can still tell what the original language was, where it came from, the core of it. And that's what's connected with Athabascan. Does that help answer the question?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. That makes the job even twice as hard because it's a two-way.
That's right.
We're talking
Yeah.
about this evolution.
That's right.
But it's a mixing.
Yeah.
It's two ways.
But it is hard because you have to weed out borrowings, you have to weed out influence of other languages, but it's not as hard always as you think, because a lot of times the things that are borrowed, you can tell they're superficial, or they're only borrowed into one branch, or they're innovated only in one area of the language family, and they don't go back to the thing that is common to all of them. And that ancient thing that's common to all of them is the thing that is normally going to be parallel to a language family that's related to it at a deeper time depth. So it's not impossible, and it's not as hard as you might think. There's a system to the language mixing that still you can preserve, in most cases, that ancient lineage. There's some things in languages that are kind of like the Y DNA that keep on just staying the same and being passed down. And there are other things that get mixed up faster. Cultural vocabulary, for instance, can be very quickly borrowed and lost. But basic vocabulary words for body parts and kinship terms, those tend to stay in the language and not be borrowed. But sometimes they are. If you have two tribes mixing and being bilingual, you can have all that mixed up like the Vikings and the Old English, for instance. We have very basic vocabulary words borrowed into English from a Viking language because of exactly that. But in Yeniseian, it looks like the core of the language really is preserved from a very long time ago. And the influence of other languages, you can see it more superficially over top of that, and even trace how it developed and why it developed. You can explain that. Athabascan languages also, they don't like to mix with other languages. They had their own communities, and they tended to keep to themselves. They didn't borrow words from other languages. They're very conservative in that way. Ket is the same way. It didn't like to borrow words. Even modern Ket, even though they all speak Russian, when they're speaking Ket, they don't stick Russian words in the Ket. And if one of them does, the others laugh at them. Oh, you're speaking Russian. All right, and for instance, so you call a car, of course there aren't any cars there at all, but if they go to a city, there's cars, and they call them Eikswool, which is iron snow sled. And coffee is Kolaul, which means bitter water. And cake is Hilyang, which means nyan is an ancient Iranic borrowing, and if you go to an Indian restaurant, you get naan. It's the same word that the Kets borrowed somewhere way back in time from some Iranic tribe. The word for cake means sweet bread, or birch sap bread. That's what, if you want to really be technical about it. But sometimes they borrow words, like the word that means tea is sai. It's borrowed from either Russian chai or some other Eastern language that has that same borrowing from Chinese. So some words are borrowed, but very few, fewer than you'd expect in a language like Ket or in a language like Navajo. In a modern Navajo, there's a word for every part of the car, just like, guess what, there is in English. And they're all new. English didn't have words for parts of the car 100 years or 200 years ago before the car, and neither did the Navajo. But Navajo had no trouble developing them, just like English. And in Navajo, they did it by analogy. They didn't borrow English words. So the tire of the car is called bike, and ke is your foot. And that's cognate with the Ket, by the way. Ki is foot. And the headlight of the car is chidibna, which is the eye of the car, and so forth like that. And so the Navajo and Ket, they have a similar cultural feature. They don't like to just blindly borrow words like modern English does, or maybe modern Japanese. They base boru, and borrowing whatever is convenient, because it's free. Why not borrow everything if it's free? You don't have to pay duty on borrowing a word, so why not just do it all the time? And there's something in the Ket culture that they don't like to do that, even today. So that's interesting. All right, so maybe any more questions? Another one, perhaps?
We should probably actually.
Oh, okay, because it's already 8:30. But I really appreciate your questions and your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right.